Good evening, and welcome to the inaugural lecture in the University of Minnesota Center for Jewish Studies 2024-2025 Community Lecture Series. My name is, thank you. You'll get your ticket for a free meal later, thank you. My name is Natan Paradise, and I am the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota. And on behalf of the Minnesota JCC, I also want to welcome you to the Minnesota JCC Sabe Center and the Berry Family Campus. We appreciate the opportunity to partner with the JCC as our host for the lecture series this year, and the JCC hopes that you discover a broad range of rich programming at the Minnesota JCC, both here at Sabe's as well as at the CAP Center in St. Paul. I want to thank the staff here at the Minnesota JCC, and especially Katie Westberg, Alex Fisher, and Irit Svanitsky for their support in planning for and conducting this event, as well as our community co-sponsors, Adath Yeshurun Congregation, Bet Shalom Congregation, Beth El Synagogue, Beth Jacob Congregation, Congregation Darchei Noam, Mayim Rabim Congregation, Mount Zion Temple, Sharei Chesed Congregation, Shir Tikva, Temple of Aaron, and Temple Israel. We are also grateful to our university co-sponsors of this lecture, the Department of English, the Institute for Global Studies, the Department of History, the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, the Department of Political Science, and the Department of Sociology. And finally, I give endless thanks to our outreach coordinator, Mariel Coulter. You all met her as you came in, who continues to amaze us, by which I mean me especially, with her organizational abilities, and she keeps us on track in so many ways. This lecture, yes, thank you. This lecture is conducted in full acknowledgement that we stand on Minnesota Makoche, the homelands of the Dakota Oyate, within an area that is also the home of the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk peoples. And this acknowledgement is made in the awareness that while sitting on this land, learning about the complicated relationship between American Jews and Israel, it is appropriate to both acknowledge and commit to learning about the histories, cultures, and practices of the indigenous peoples of America and about their ongoing attachment to and struggle for sovereignty in their lands. 21 years ago, the Center for Jewish Studies established the Community Lecture Series in order to bring to campus and to the local community some of the most exciting researchers in the full range of scholarship in the field of Jewish studies, with the goal of fulfilling the educational mission of the Center for Jewish Studies as broadly as possible. I'm really pleased to see faces of friends and regular supporters in the audience. And this lecture is also being recorded, so if you know of people who could not make it tonight or could not feel comfortable attending in person, please let them know that the lecture is being recorded and it'll show up on our YouTube channel within a week or so. Our series this year is dedicated to the memory of Miriam Segal, Zichrona Livracha, who for years, she was an amazing person. For years, she made our lectures possible through a generous donation in memory of her parents, Julia Kay and Harold Segal. Without Miriam's support, many of the center's activities would be greatly restricted, and we are incredibly grateful. If you too would like to support the center's activities, ensuring the growth and continued vitality of the Center for Jewish Studies, you can visit our website to make a donation, or you may contact me or speak with me after the lecture. This lecture series is part of the Center's investment in the community, and we invite you to invest in us as well. This year, the Center is sponsoring a series entirely devoted to questions about Jewish identity. Who, what, where, how. It has been a hard year, one that has provoked all of us to both struggle and reflection. This series is designed to enter that uncomfortable space we are all inhabiting and use that discomfort as a productive opportunity to ask hard questions of ourselves and of others. Expect the series to confirm some of your beliefs and deeply challenge others. Expect that your experience of each lecture might not be the same as the person sitting next to you. Talk about that. We offer this series respectfully and hope you will respond in kind, joining us in that confidence that the earliest rabbis shared and preserved for future generations in the Talmud, that vigorous debate is a creative source of resiliency and survival. It is in that spirit that I welcome you to tonight's lecture, America's Fight Over Israel, Where Did It Come From? Where Is It Going? By Dr. Eric Alterman. Eric Alterman is a City University of New York Distinguished Professor of English and Journalism at Brooklyn College. For 25 years, he was the liberal media columnist for The Nation and is now a columnist for The American Prospect. He is the author of 12 books, including most recently, We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel, published by Basic Books in 2022, and which the Jewish Book Council called, quote, essential reading for anyone who cares about what happens next in the unfolding story of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Alterman has also been a columnist for The Guardian, The Forward, Moment, MSNBC, and Rolling Stone, as well as a contributor to The New Yorker and The Atlantic. He is a former senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and the World Policy Institute, and served on the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. He has been a media fellow at the Hoover Institute and a fellow of the Schusterman Foundation and the Society of American Historians. And as if all this were not enough, Alterman is also a winner of the George Orwell Prize, the Stephen Crane Literary Award, and twice the recipient of the Mirror Award for Media Criticism. Please join me in welcoming Eric Alterman.
Thanks for coming, everybody. You know, all those groups that are sponsoring this talk, like, I'm from New York, you know, you couldn't get Jewish groups to agree on anything like that. They couldn't agree on the kind of locks that they serve, belly locks, gravel locks, so I'm very impressed by this Minnesota niceness, that it extends this far. I just want to suck up to the audience for a couple of minutes. I'm staying at the Graduate Hotel, you know, which is very nice. And they give you little key cards with famous Minnesotans on it. And I got one with Mary Tyler Moore, you know. and it reminded me that that's my first experience of Minnesota was with Mary Richards. I think that, you know, I was thinking about Minnesota. I've been actually reading. I have a little bit of insomnia, and I've been reading these stories by Curtis Sittenfeld at night, that in a short story book that she's about to publish, that all take place in Minnesota. It sounds like a weirdly civilized place. But also, as you all know, it punches way above its weight in terms of history and culture in the United States. I mean, if all you had was that fellow from Hibbing who went to Herzl summer camp, I would say Dayenu. But you also had my late friend Paul Wellstone. You had my friend Al Franken, who I just had dinner with last week, who sends his regards. And you have this governor who's like, he's amazing. Like, we better win Pennsylvania, but still, I was for him. And he's a really good advertisement for Minnesota. Like, he keeps saying, well, we in Minnesota, and it's amazing what he's been able to accomplish. And it speaks very well of the people here, that guy is your governor. So I'm happy to be here. Feel a little confused by how it's all possible. But I'm probably going to upset you with everything else I say. So remember that. So this book that I wrote, I'm very proud of it. It's the only thing I've ever written in my life that I don't feel I need to take anything back. But it's a weird book because I would say it doesn't take sides. I mean, I have strong feelings about things, and I'm happy to answer questions of people who say, how do you feel about this or that? But I wrote this book as a historian rather than as a partisan. At least I tried to. And I spent literally 40 years on it. I wrote my undergraduate honors thesis. I'm such a nerd, I saved the notes from my undergraduate, little note cards, and they appear in the book. And that was I graduated in college in 1982. And then when I was doing my doctorate 10 years later, I also spent a year researching this book. And I ended up doing my doctorate on something else. And I saved those notes. And I have been thinking and writing about, for some reason, this particular topic of the fight over Israel and Palestine in the United States among scholars and columnists and Jewish community leaders. It's, for some reason, I've cared a great deal about it, and I've paid very close attention to it. And like I said, I wrote a book that I am proud of, which I don't say about. Well, I'm proud of all my books, but this is the one. Now, the reason I wrote this book is because clearly I had this obsession that lasted 40-something years. But I also wrote it for a couple of other reasons. One is that I find that I made a rule in my life that I wouldn't discuss Israel-Palestine really at all, if I could avoid it. Because if you notice, it's almost impossible to discuss with anyone who does not share exactly the same assumptions about the conflict. And it's not like global warming or economic inequality. Because you can disagree on economic inequality or global warming, but if I tell you that, like, if the temperature goes up 3 degrees in the next 50 years, then we're going to, things are going to suck, and I have the qualifications to tell you that, you're probably going to believe me. But if I tell you something about Israel-Palestine that offends your understanding of it, you're not going to say, oh, okay, I'm changing my mind about Israel-Palestine. You're going to say, wait a minute, what about this? It's a question of people's identity, not of people's understanding of the issue, more than anything else. This has long been true of American Jews. It's become true of people who are anti-Israel or consider themselves to be anti-Zionist as much as anything else. And this is something relatively new, and I hope I'm going to get to that. I have notes here. I don't know how long they take. I should take my watch off and take a look at this. But for the longest time, Israel occupied this, it still does, but it was unchallenged for a long time. It occupied this really interesting place in American life where it a story that Israel and its supporters told about Israel in the United States went relatively unchallenged, even though it had a lot of inconsistency with reality. So I'll read a little bit and then I'll just talk over my notes. But I want to read the beginning because I think it's strong. The space that Israel occupies in U.S. political debates is by any measure extraordinary. In a land area, the Jewish state ranks 149th on a list of 195 independent nations. It is smaller than Belize and El Salvador, and only slightly larger than Slovenia. And yet, despite its size and despite its distance from the United States, Israel, and particularly its conflicts with the Palestinians and surrounding nations, remains one of the most intensely debated topics in all of American politics. And the participants in these debates often treat competing arguments not as matters of policy, but as challenges to their personal identities. This tendency has long been evident among American Jews, but in recent decades it's also been true of conservative Christians. More and more it's true of Israel's opponents as well. Now, the debate itself, I learned a lot writing this book. I thought I knew a lot, but the more you learn about something, the more you learn how much you don't know. America's, again, this is just part of what I'm introducing. America's generosity to Israel is literally unparalleled, not only in U.S. history, but in the history of any nation at all. Since its founding in 1948, Israel has been by far the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, despite the fact that it has grown to be among the world's wealthiest nations, as measured by per capita income. Israel receives this aid earlier than other countries, this is a quote, from two Israeli scholars. Earlier than other countries, with fewer limitations on how to use the funds and minimal bureaucratic oversight, essentially unaudited. And it is one of the few countries that benefit from laws permitting tax deductions for contributions to foreign charities. Since 1997, the United States has had a law that demands that it vet the human rights records of all military units in any nation that enjoy U.S. aid. Alas, according to a 2021 study published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Israel is, quote, the only country in the world for which the United States does not have a tracking mechanism to determine which weapons go to which military unit, and hence is free to ignore this requirement. U.S. law ensures that Israel receives sufficient military support to maintain a, quote, qualitative military edge over any and all combinations of potential adversaries, preferential treatment as a bidder for U.S. defense contracts, and is often given surplus U.S. equipment at no cost at all. Under President Obama, who, by the way, people attack for not being insufficiently pro-Israel, the Israelis didn't like Obama. They liked, I mentioned this later, but Israel is the only country in the world that preferred Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. Under President Barack Obama, the United States signed a memorandum of understanding, which is a law, to which it committed itself to providing Israel with $38 billion of military aid over a period of 9 years. There's nothing like this in the history of any two countries, a 9-year commitment to give Israel $3.8 billion a year. And that's just part of it. The economic and the military aid is just part of it. In the UN, the United States has consistently defended Israel. Between 1946 and 2012, half of the vetoes of the United States enjoyed in the United States used in the UN Security Council were devoted to the defense of Israel. Okay, I could go on and on, but I think you get it. Interestingly, American Jews were for a very long time anti-Zionist. There was a Zionist movement that predated Herzl. The modern Zionist movement began with Theodore Herzl in 1896, 1897. But for a long time, Christians were Zionists, in part because of their theology having to do with the Book of Revelation. And American Jews were dead set against the idea of Zionism. This was in part because the German Jews, there have been two great Jewish immigrations into the United States. The German Jews came in the mid-19th century, and there were only about 250,000 of them. And then the Eastern European Jews came as the Tsarist Empire collapsed between 1880 and 1924, when immigration was shut down in the United States. But the German Jews were 100% against Zionism because they were trying very hard to prove their patriotism to the Protestant America, and they felt like that if Jews had their own country, that it would call into question their loyalty to the United States. They insisted that Judaism was a religion and nothing more, and that Zionists were undermining their ability to achieve equality in the United States, and they loved the United States, with good reason. The United States was the only country in the world at that point in history that ever said to Jews, you can be whatever you want in this country. There's never been any laws restricting Jewish behavior in America. Oh, there was a brief moment where Ulysses S. Grant on the battlefield restricted Jews, but then the president overturned it right away. So they loved America with good reason, and they didn't want these Zionists saying, we don't belong here. And the person who flipped this understanding was Louis Brandeis, who was on the Supreme Court. And he said, no, we don't need Zionism in America because we have everything great here, but other Jews need a place to go. So we can be good Jews, good Americans, and good Zionists, since we're not interested in going there ourselves. We're just interested in helping other Jews. And that happened in the 1920s. But for a long time, the German Jews remained anti-Zionist, and the Eastern European Jews, who overwhelmed the European Jews, 2 million of them came over in this period. They were actually pro-Zionist because a lot of their family members couldn't get into America, so they ended up going to Palestine. And also the Eastern European Jews understood themselves to be part of a Jewish nation, not necessarily a Jewish religion. They were not, some of them were anti-religious, many of them were radicals, socialists, anarchists, communists, and so forth. But they were all Jews. And they had a very different understanding of what it meant to be Jewish, and that it was consistent with the idea of having a Jewish homeland. Of course, when people began very slowly to learn about the Holocaust and the horror of what had happened and how, of course, as I'm sure you all know, there was no country that would allow Jews to come in. Hitler, made sure of that before he began his program of mass murder. Most of the opposition to Zionism dissipated, not all of it. The American Jewish Committee remained very uncomfortable with Zionism, ironically, if you look at where they are today. But American Jews, as they learned what happened, this is very important today. American Jews experienced this enormous crisis over the fact that they hadn't been able to help the Jews of Europe when they learned how horrible things had been. People didn't really know. Some people knew, but even those people who knew, they couldn't really handle the knowledge. The many leaders of Jewish organizations met with people who had escaped from Germany and certain countries, and they would tell them what was going on, and no one could believe it. And of course, the Jewish press covered it, but no major American newspaper covered it. If you ask the people, the Sulzberger family, and say, what are you most ashamed of in your history as stewards of the New York Times, they would say how terribly we covered the Holocaust, how we buried the news and didn't take it seriously. That's not a controversial view. So when the battle came in the late 1940s, mid-late 1940s, the American Jews, again, there was some grumbling among some German Jews, but basically they threw themselves into this lobbying campaign to help the Zionists in their battle for what became Israel. And again, for a while it wasn't clear that there was going to be a state. There was going to be something, a homeland. It didn't necessarily have to be a state. It came to have to be a state because there were no Palestinians or other Arabs in the area that had any interest in agreeing to any kind of deal. But the enthusiasm, it's very interesting. The enthusiasm for the creation of the State of Israel among American Jews was phenomenal. They had the largest lobbying campaign in all of human history to try and get first Franklin Roosevelt and then President Truman to help the Zionists create their state. There were synagogues that sold their buildings. There were some localities that sent more postcards to Congress than they had people in their entire towns. And it became a political issue there wasn't really no opposition. There was some Republican conservative opposition because they thought that Israel was going to be socialist and therefore allied with the Soviet Union. And there was some Arab opposition, but the Arabs were completely disorganized and didn't count for anything. The oil companies were the people who didn't like it. The State Department didn't like it. The Defense Department didn't like it. The National Security Bureaucracy didn't like it because they felt strategically it was threatening the United States' access to oil into that part of the world. But politically speaking, it was the easiest call in the world for Truman to support the creation of the State of Israel. As you may know, the Israelis, the Jews in the Yishuv, that's the name of what the Jews were called in Israel at the time, it was a very close vote on whether or not to declare the State of Israel after the UN voted to divide Palestine. I think it succeeded only by one vote. And secretly, Ben Gurion went to the British and said, will you please say another 10 years? We're not ready. Which is amazing in the context of everything else. I have trouble understanding how that could have happened. But anyway, when Israel was declared, when Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel on, it was May 12th or May 14th, I forget the exact date, 1948, President Truman recognized the State of Israel 11 minutes later. And this was absolutely crucial. But again, he was overruling Secretary of State George Marshall, who was the most respected American figure besides Dwight Eisenhower, the general who had, one of the two generals who had won the war, as well as his entire national security bureaucracy. But also he wanted to win New York, he wanted to win Ohio, he wanted to win Pennsylvania, and that was an easy call. Now, interestingly, again, this was a fantastic outpouring of love for, or of pride really, of pride in what the Zionists were doing after the Holocaust, after Jews had, failed to resist the Holocaust. And here these Jews were telling a whole new story about what it meant to be Jewish, and it thrilled American Jews. But you'll be shocked to hear that, I think, that Israel, after the State of Israel was declared, it stopped being important in American life and in American Jewish life. It wasn't really discussed at all. It was kind of like I would compare it to Disneyland. Like it was some place that a few people would go visit and they heard nice things about it. There were occasional articles about it where the Jews were sort of portrayed like they were Californians, like they had really good tans, and the women were very pretty, and the men would write poetry in the morning and then fight a war in the afternoon and then make love at night. But there was very little engagement. When Israel was founded, the Israeli leaders expected all of the Jews in the world to come to Israel and be safe. And the Israeli ambassador wrote back to Ben-Gurion saying, bringing up making Aliyah among Americans is kind of like asking if the bride is a virgin. It's not something you do. It's really bad manners here. No one's coming. So again, this idea that Brandeis had that Americans could be Zionists without actually doing the Zionist thing, which is going to Israel and creating Zion, that stuck, and it has always stuck. So all of that changed. Oh, I guess I want to make one other point, which was in this period, 1948, the left was almost 100% in support of Israel, in support of the Jews. So the Nation and the New Republic and the Socialist Party and Henry Wallace, who was the sort of proto-communist candidate against Harry Truman in 1948, briefly he was editor of the New Republic. The issue for the left in those days was who are the imperialists and who are the anti-imperialists. And ironically today, if you think of, if you know the debate today, the Israelis were the anti-imperialists, and the Arabs were considered, they weren't treated really as fully human in this debate. They were just the sort of the stooges of the British who were the imperialists. They weren't given any agency in this calculation. And that's why the Soviet Union supported the creation of Israel, because they wanted to get rid of the British. So the fact that the Soviet Union supported Israel and the left supported Israel set the terms of this debate, where the right wing, again, they didn't like Israel because they were worried about socialism. They didn't really know the difference between socialism and communism. And so the debate sort of was frozen in that place. Now, again, things were happening. There's a long, if you have questions about this, I'll talk about it, but there was a long argument between Ben-Gurion, the president of Israel, and the head of the American Jewish Committee about whether or not we American Jews were living in exile. And the American Jews said, we're not living in exile. If you want us to keep writing checks, you have to say that out loud. And Ben-Gurion would say it out loud, and then the next day he would say, you are living in exile. And this went on for a long time. And the State Department was always saying to the Israelis, you have to deal with the people you've kicked out. Israel kicked out certainly at least 75% of the 750,000 Arabs who left. Some of them left on their own, but most were forced out. An entirely different story was told about that. There was a creation of this mythical radio broadcast from Arab leaders. Some of you who are my age or older probably heard about these radio broadcasts that told the Arabs to leave, and as soon as we defeat the Israelis and the Jews and kick them out, you can come back to your olive grove and so forth. And there were no radio. No one's ever found any evidence of it. That was completely made up, a story for American Jews to feel better about that. Now, two things I learned. I came into this. I'll speak personally just for a moment, but I'm speaking as a historian. When I started this book, I was very disappointed with the way Israel was behaving, but I blamed it all on the occupation. I thought that the occupation was a kind of cancer that was spreading to Israel, and that everything, it had been a nice little country until 1967, when the occupation began. I learned two facts that I still find shocking about Israel itself, that I bet you don't know. I bet you don't know. Some of you, most of you. One is that after Israel expelled, again, roughly 700,000 Palestinians, and by the way, those are the IDF's figures. They bragged about having done so. They expropriated all of the land that those people had owned for the state. So the Jewish agency, which controls all, you don't own, if you buy land in Israel, you don't actually own it. You get a 99-year lease on it because the land belongs to the Jewish agency. 93% of that land is for Jews. 7% of it is for Arabs. And that land was expropriated from these Arabs who left. The second thing, which I had no idea of, is that until 1966, so from 1948 to 1966, the Arabs who remained, about 150,000 remained, they lived under martial law in Israel. So the idea that the Arabs and the Jews lived equally in Israel ever is nonsense. They lived under martial law, and they could be shot, and some were, for being out after curfew. They couldn't go to visit their cousins in the next village without the permission of the military government. And there's some terrible stories about that. So I had no idea that this was the case, and it changed for me my understanding of the relationship between Israel and the Arabs. The Israeli position has always been, we want our Arabs to be happy in living in Israel, and we want to give them all the democratic rights we can. We want to treat them equally, but that's a story they told Americans. It's not something they ever acted upon. They acted upon the opposite. Now, that's just sort of a foundational knowledge so that you can better understand the American debate and the relationship between Israel and the United States, which, by the way, fundamentally changed, I'm getting this, but fundamentally changed with 1967. So from 48 to 67, it was one story, and then from 67 to the present, it's a completely different story. Now I'll turn to the American Jewish community for a few minutes. So much of Israel's success in securing the support of so many U.S. administrations, well, actually, let me read a paragraph before that, just to give you an idea of how strong American support for Israel has been in its conflict with the Palestinians. Aleph Ben, still editor-in-chief, of Israel's Haaretz newspaper, summed up the history of this relationship between the United States and Israel in 2021, writing, "From the day Israel was granted independence, and even before that, relations with the Palestinians have been the central topic on the agenda of the Zionist movement and the State of Israel. And since 1948, every American president and administration has acted in accordance with Israel's stance without exception. This was true, quote, even as the presidents grumbled about the settlements, sought to restrain the Israeli army in Lebanon or Gaza, or mediated the peace process. Never, Ben continued, has any U.S. administration asked Israel to dismantle the settlements or grant the Palestinian refugees from 1948 the right of return, issues which are the foundation of the Arab stance of the conflict. Moreover, despite the wide-ranging support of the international community to end the occupation and establish a Palestinian state, the American veto in the UN Security Council has impeded any plan for internal pressure or sanctions against Israel aimed at changing Israeli policy." And you can see that's basically true of Joe Biden today. Much of Israel's success in securing the support of so many U.S. administrations has been due to the efforts of American Jews and their practice of what Cornell University political scientist Benedict Anderson has called long-distance nationalism. Anderson coined the term to define the relationship between exiles, immigrants, and offspring of any individual home nation. Now you think about long-distance nationalism, think about the Irish, you know. There's more Irish people in New York than there are in Ireland. And they care about Ireland, and they have parades, and they drink together, and they have communities which remain strong, and they go back and visit their country. But and that's true of lots of different ethnicities. But the American Jewish community in Israel is unique. And what is most extraordinary about it is that this nationalist commitment is dedicated to a country where few American Jews have ever lived, where a language is spoken in which precious few are fluent, and that many have never even visited. And in December 2018, Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi proudly proclaimed to a Jewish audience that if the U.S. Capitol ever crumbled to the ground, the very last thing that would remain would be our support for Israel. Now, okay, I want to, how am I doing on time? How much more time do I have? 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm only up to 1967. All right, so here are the points. I want to have a vigorous discussion. I don't want to just lecture. So here are the larger points that I would like to make. I'm just going to make them as points. So in 1967, it appeared in the media that Israel was threatened with destruction. There was a quote that Nasser was going to drive the Jews into the sea, that he said that. He never did say that, but people heard it a lot. And of course, Egypt and Syria combined their armies, getting ready to attack Israel. And American Jews were by now much more self-confident, much more, had risen much further in society than they had in the Holocaust. And they said, damn it, we're not going to let this happen again. We're strong enough that we don't have to keep quiet. We're not afraid. And then Israel, 6 days, it's very symbolic, 6 days. It's like God stepped into history. And the victory was so profound, and it was so inconsistent with the idea of what Jews had been and actually still were in the United States. These weren't accountants and doctors and lawyers, They were, again, people like, if you've seen Exodus or read the movie, they were like Ari Ben Canaan, And Exodus is very important in this argument. And it was like the greatest thing that ever happened to American Jews. American Jews, before 1967, they didn't really know what it meant to be Jewish anymore. It just meant to be liberal, really, unless you were an Orthodox Jew. But if you read the American Jewish Committee report of 1966, it didn't mention Israel until, I think, page 37. It was really indistinguishable from the ACLU report of 1966. But almost overnight, there was this profound transformation that shocked the people it was happening to. That their love for the state of Israel, what we now call their Zionism, became the center of their identity, and it gave meaning to their identity as Jews. And the way that they manifested this, again, they didn't move to Israel, but they dedicated significant amounts of money, and they hassled any media writer who wrote anything critical of Israel, and they had their Yom Kippur pledges. The soldiers would come to shul and give a speech, and everybody would give, everybody would cry and give money, and again, the Palestinians had nothing. The Palestinians, in my book, one reason that my book is problematic to most people is that it's very, as you can hear, I'm very critical of the way Israel has treated the Palestinians and the way the United States has indulged that, but I'm also very critical of the Palestinians because they've never embraced the reality of their position, which is that they're the much weaker party here, that nations are determined by power, not by arguments about who's more moral and who's right. And the Palestinians have always taken a maximalist position beginning in 1922, when they could have kept their majority. And of course in 1947, when they refused to meet with the UN even to discuss what was to be done with Mandate Palestine. And basically ever since. There have been moments where it looked like they might agree to compromise, but they never really were able to, in part because they remained so divided. One thing I will say on behalf of the Zionists and the Jews of this period is that one of their great strengths was how being Jews, how hard they fought with each other to find a position that would be acceptable to all and represent a sort of consensus. The Palestinians don't fight out loud. They feel that they're so weak that they're not allowed to have open disagreements because it will weaken them. And so they remain committed to arguments that have already been discredited. There's a famous meeting where Edward Said, who was kind of a friend of mine, and Noam Chomsky had a meeting. Noam Chomsky, the most famous intellectual in the world, but also, along with Edward Said, the most prominent champion of the Palestinians. And Said, who was then on the Palestine National Council, brought Chomsky to meet the heads of the PLO in the 1970s. And they were talking, and Chomsky said, "What the hell country do you think you're trying to get support for? All this Marxist rhetoric and all this dress-up stuff. This is not how you convince Americans to do anything." And they had a lot of trouble accepting that. They were so divided and so weak and so dispirited that they've never been able to mount a serious challenge to Israel, politically speaking, and that's true today. You may worry about your children who are, faced with encampments, or maybe they're in encampments, because I'd say about 30% of those kids are Jewish. Nobody really knows, but that's my guess. But in fact, Israel is as strong politically in Congress and in the Americas as it's ever been. And that's because of the weakness of their opposition, even though today young people are more pro-Palestinian than they are pro-Israel, if you look at the surveys. Young American Jews are actually pretty close to that position. Not exactly, but pretty close. So American Jews began in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, to be very uncomfortable with the way Israel was behaving. American Jews are, as you know, famously liberal. They're after blacks, they're the most loyal democratic constituency. But their liberalism and their Zionism began to conflict as the story of Israel became less of a fairy tale and more of the reality of a regional superpower. And so the conflict has played out in a lot of interesting ways. Part of it has been, this is where my expertise comes in, because I was 25 years at media columnist for The Nation. A great deal of it is the attachment of Jews to attacking the media whenever anything is reported unfavorable about Israel. That's I would say, if not a primary manifestation of what it means to be a Jew of a certain generation in this country, is to attack the media for being too hard on Israel. But I'm going to end early and just make two larger points, because I want to make a couple of points that I hope will inspire discussion. So the larger points I want to make are this, that first of all, Israel has turned into a very different country than people thought it was. It's a different country than it actually was, but it's certainly a different country than it thought it was. So the current government of Israel, which has one guy who's like some other presidents I know, trying to avoid jail by persecuting terrible politics. It has in charge of its army a literal terrorist, a guy who was wanted for supporting terrorism, and a very homophobic right-wing extremist. And that's the government that is in power in Israel. It's largely supported by Mizrahi Jews, who are Jews from the Arab world. And the idea of the Jews that I grew up emulating in my mind anyway, like novelist Amasaz and Yehuda Amichai and the great poets who also were warriors. You know, I liked that idea too as a child. Though that's long gone. That generation of people. Israel had 5 elections in a row where no one mentioned the peace process. It was just not an issue. And that's not how Americans think about Israel. They think Israel just wants peace if the Arabs just agree to it. And that's just not true. Israel has made it very clear they want to keep the land rather than the peace. And they're not interested in giving the people on that land the same rights that Jews have. There's a word for that. I'm not going to use it today, but if you ask me, I'll use it. And the second thing, and this is actually where I come out in the book with a kind of cause, which is even if you, obviously I don't, but even if you think that everything that Israel has done is absolutely correct, even if you don't criticize what's happened since October 7th, and I haven't mentioned October 7th, but the things I've written like 20 articles since October 7th that all say everything that I wrote about in my book is just more intense now. Like people have gotten harder and stronger in their positions, but really nothing has changed. But the fact is that, look, we're okay here, right? You had to sign in, you know, you had to show your ID. But we're not living in Israel. We're not fighting a war in Gaza and another one in Lebanon and another one vis-a-vis Iran, and we're not bombing Syria and Yemen. Israel's fighting 7 wars now, if you include the West Bank. Our lives are very different than the Israelis. And Israel, again, is not the country that when my parents sent me when I was 14 years old and again when I was 16, and then I went there for a semester when I was in college. It's not that country anymore. It's not a country. The idea that one can build one's Jewish identity on one's quote-unquote Zionism is no longer the case. In part because it's just a very different place. Their experience is very different than that of American Jews. In part because to most liberal American Jews, which is still most American Jews, it's a very unattractive place in terms of the mainstream culture. And the third reason is that the young people in this country, and certainly the left, have turned very much against Israel. And I'm actually critical of how hard this turn has become. So that if you want to join a feminist group or an anti-racist group at a university, or you want to be on the staff of the Nation magazine, you have to proclaim your anti-Zionism. It's just like being anti-war in Vietnam, but that was A, a war that this country was fighting, and B, it was a pretty clear case. There was a movement, and if you want to be part of that movement, there were certain positions you had to hold. But today, Israel used to be a source of pride and unity among American Jews. And it was also a place that the idea was Jews are not safe anywhere in the world, they'll be safe in Israel. But now, not only are Jews not safe in Israel, Israel is endangering Jews elsewhere in the world. And it's also making life very hard for Jews. You can't really give a sermon about Israel in a synagogue anymore, because you don't know who you're speaking to, politically speaking. And on college campuses, you wouldn't believe the security they were trying to sell me on just to speak tomorrow at the University of Minnesota, because they're so worried about what's going to happen, because I'm talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Nobody knows what I'm going to say. It's just the very topics are so incendiary. Again, it's fascinating that actually none of this is affecting Congress very much, or the president. Biden is just as pro-Israel as Obama and Clinton were. And in Congress you might get, 20 votes out of 538 to punish Israel for violating American laws with its weapons or stopping, the starvation of Gaza. But basically Israel is completely safe. Kamala Harris very strongly says there's nothing that Israel can possibly do that will shake my support for its security. That's not good enough for a lot of people. You may or may not know that Donald Trump is doing better with American Jews than any candidate has done since 1988. According to polls, and he's certainly the preferred candidate of the Israelis. So what I'm saying is, and this is, you're supposed to end talks optimistically. And I can do that in this narrow sense, that I started to say that in the 1950s and early 1960s, before 1967, American Jews, unless you were an Orthodox American Jew, it was hard to explain what it meant to be Jewish. I mean, because you didn't believe that Mary was a virgin. It doesn't come up a lot. It's not very important. So now we're kind of back where that was, because the commitment to Zionism, I mean, you could say this particular moment is a crisis on either side. But we're back to where that was, because conservative Judaism has lost a third of its followers in the past 15 years. Reform Jews have lost 15%, but that's artificially high because a lot of those people are conservatives who are dropping down like one level. They're playing double A ball instead of pro ball. But that's the first time I've said that. I'm going to remember that line. But the fact is that the Jewish community is shrinking rapidly, particularly among young people. And that's because they've invested so heavily in Zionism as the purpose of the meaning of one's Jewish identity, and it no longer works. And if you're saying to young people, you have to support Israel or you can't be a good Jew, well, then they say, okay, I won't be a good Jew, and my children will not be Jewish at all. Over 50% of American Jews marry non-Jews, and over half of them do not raise Jewish children. So there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just this, but it's a reason. And it concerns me a great deal, because I was raised badly as far as Jewishness goes, but I discovered it in my 30s, and for the past 20 years it's been the most interesting, exciting, rewarding thing I've ever studied. And it's become the center of my identity. And it's not about Israel, it's about this incredibly rich historical tradition that is, I have a lot of friends who are Jewish intellectuals without any Judaism. And they say, why are you wasting all your time studying Judaism? And I say, look, it's some of the smartest people of all time arguing across time and space about how to be a good person. And what could be more useful than that if you've got the time, anyway? And I do, because I have a nice professorship where they don't ask very much of me. So I look at this as a moment where American Jews, all diaspora Jews, but more than half diaspora, 80% of Jews in the world live in Israel or the United States. So 80% of the diaspora is in the United States. And we need to reinvent what it means to be a Jew in the diaspora, particularly an American Jew, because American Jews are disappearing. The Jews that we think of, most of the Jews in this room, I'm not seeing lots of black hats in here. The Orthodox Jews are doing just fine. They have 6 kids, 40% of the Jewish babies born in New York are ultra-Orthodox. So I would like to see some investment, instead of sending kids to Israel to Project Hookup with the Israeli soldiers. I would like to see money invested, and my partner's daughter, she married a guy she met there, so I'm not against the idea of it, but I would like to see some investment in returning to that question. What does it mean to be a diaspora Jew? The diaspora has been around for a very long time, depending on how you calculate it. I would say it's been around since the year 500. That's when the Talmud was finished. That's when I think people were really Jews. And Israel's only been around for 75 years. And okay, like it or not, there's a lot more to Judaism than that, and we've let it slide. So I would like to see. I think this is a propitious moment to start asking that question again, as much as we appear to be in a crisis in other kinds of ways. I still think it's the central question that faces us. And it's a good time for it. So, you doing that? Are you doing that? Are you doing that? No, are you doing that at the center at Minneapolis? At the university? Give them some money. That's my point. It's not a Jewish audience if you don't ask for money. Thank you. Let's have a discussion. You can speak. You don't have to ask a question, but you only got 30 seconds.
So I have a question. I'm kind of surprised that you didn't talk about Jewish peoplehood. And I heard your analysis was your analysis. I'm not gonna talk about that. But I'm surprised that your framing. I heard your framing as somewhat binary between the diaspora and Israel, and I don't think about it that way, and I don't live that way. And many people that I know, we know Israelis well. We go to their houses, they come to our house. We go to their communities. My kids' summer campers are Israeli. We have a lot of back and forth. We are a peoplehood with a lot of challenges. And I like to think of us as one people who are trying to figure out this moment that we're in. And I'm wondering why your framing isn't a little more peoplehood oriented for all of us Jews who are trying to figure out this moment in our world.
Well, I believe in Jewish peoplehood. I'm not one of those people who says it's a religion and not a people. I think it's a people.
It is a people.
Yeah, well, not everyone would agree with that, but I agree with it. But I nevertheless think that the Israeli experience is very different than the American Jewish experience, and that you can't live. I always forget this word. I learned it like in 5th grade. Living through someone else. What's that word? Vicariously. Yes. I think that vicarious living is unsustainable, and it's particularly unsustainable given the country that Israel has become. Now, I have people I love in Israel. I have family in Israel. I have people I greatly admire in Israel. But Israel is their problem. Okay, we have our own problems, and you can help them with their problems, but you still have to address your own problems. And what has happened in this country is we have allowed our own problems to atrophy because we have paid 100% of our attention to their problems. That's how I see it. But I don't dispute the idea of peoplehood. I think Jews are people, and that's actually what I find so interesting. I mean, I think Jews are really weird and interesting. Like weird in a good way, not in an advanced way. But they're unique. I mean, the one thing that I meant to say that I didn't say and I usually try and say this is that one problem with the debate over Israel and most debates about Jews is that they're both unique. Like if someone gets up and says, "You colonialists, you settler colonialists," it's not settler colonialism. It doesn't fit the definition at all. I mean, what's the country that you're settling from? There's no country unless you think that Israel is just an outpost of Western imperialism, which obviously it's not, because if it were, they would do more of what we wanted them to do. And as I said, it's this long distance nationalism of American Jews has no corollary in any other ethnic community. And the ability of American Jews, it's not just American Jews today, actually today, evangelical Christians are more supportive of Israel than American Jews are, much more. And actually, maybe Netanyahu says, "What do we need American Jews? They're always hassling me. We have the Christians, we have the whole Republican Party. We don't have to be nice. We don't have to listen to them."
There's our best interest at heart.
Well, yeah, but they don't care about that. It's like how many troops has the Pope, So the thing about both Jews and Israel and the relationship between Jews and Israel is there is no real analogy to it. And if you try to think about it in analogous terms, you distort the reality. And that's why I wrote a 512-page book with 66 pages of footnotes, because the reality is something that everyone ignores when they debate it. If you say this, someone says, "Yeah, but that." And if they feel like if you use a word that they don't like, then you're written off, and what you have to say is of no value. So I'm trying to say, look, you don't have to agree with me, but here are the facts and here's the footnotes, and, you know, take it from there. Sir?
One correction or one question. You said that the head of the army had a terrorist past. I think you meant to say the head of the police.
Yeah, okay, thank you. You're right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely right. I appreciate that, yes.
Question is this, in your book, how much, they seem like a long time ago, how much did you write about the Yom Kippur War? I mean, 73 is a long time, but there's some realities that came out at that point that you have to mention.
I write quite a lot about the 73 War.
Specifically, I'm asking about who allowed, among the European states, who allowed the American rearmament planes to land on their way, because that was critical for Israel to turn the tide in that war. At least that's what we understand. So there was one country that permitted it, and it was Portugal and the Azore Islands only.
Yeah,
No other country.
again, the 1970 War is another issue where most of what people know is wrong. I mean, that part's true. But actually, Israel comes off better in the 1970 War than the United States does. Henry Kissinger prevented Egypt from talking to Israel about peace. And the Israelis were interested, and Kissinger was not interested in allowing it to happen. He actually encouraged the Egyptians to attack Israel because he thought it would create a situation whereby he could wean the Arab world from the Soviet Union. And also, I don't agree with this, but people who don't think Kissinger is as horrible as I think he is, give him credit for creating the conditions whereby Israel and Egypt could later sign a peace agreement that Jimmy Carter, in my view, deserves all the credit for. You know, that airlift, I take the airlift seriously. However, it didn't turn the tide of the war because you can't like get the weapons to the people and put them in the field in the amount of time it took Israel to win the war. They won the war like while they were just replacing the weapons that they had already used. They didn't. So the airlift was incredibly symbolic, and it made a lot of Jews much more sympathetic to Republicans because Nixon did it. He did it over the objections of Kissinger and over the objections of the Pentagon. It's why the Israelis told American Jews to vote for Nixon and to support Nixon. There's this famous meeting. It's just like when Stalin said how many troops as the Pope. Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin was the U.S. ambassador in the 70s from Israel. And he sent out a letter to American Jews saying, I want you to support Nixon in 1972. And Jews were like, what? We're liberals. We're not supporting Nixon. We hate Nixon. And then, and so there was a meeting of rabbis with Golda Meir when she came to the country. She was prime minister. And they said, you can't. You got to stop saying this stuff about Nixon. We hate him. And she said, rabbis, where are your F-16s? Israel has always been incredibly unsentimental about defending itself, as you can see today, incredibly unsentimental. And American Jews, for the longest time, had this bifurcated attitude in their heads where we're liberals, but because Israel is in such a difficult position, and because of Jewish history, and because of the Holocaust, and because it's not us who are on the line, I mean, I could give you 20 different reasons. It's not for us to judge what they're doing, and whether it's just our job to support them. And I'm saying that argument is over today. That argument is over. Whether you like it or not, it's over. And the fact that Jewish leadership in this country refuses to accept that it's over is what's losing us a lot of Jews in the next generation. Okay? All right.
Are there primary sources not from the Arab world for your figure of 75% of the Palestinians who left in 1947, 1948?
My source for that is the Israeli Defense Force bragging to the Prime Minister that they expelled 700,000 Arabs. They might have been exaggerating it. They might not have They might have said they had expelled more, in fact, than they did. But that's my source for that particular fact. Not supposed to call on only men.
I was a little concerned with the way you're painting a binary of Israel. It used to be this way, and now it's this right-wing country where nobody cares about peace. You have to realize that, as you know, it's a coalition government. So right now, probably 25% of the country maybe supports Netanyahu's party. He's ruling not because everybody agrees with his policies relating to the Arabs and the peace process, but because of a whole other...
What party in Israel is arguing for peace?
So that's the other point I'm going to make. When I went to J Street about 6-7 years ago, and the group I most identified with were the Israeli liberals, because they were the ones that shared my values and actually understood the situation on the ground. And the majority of the Americans that were there had no clue what was going on the ground. And so for us to
Well, wait a minute, you didn't answer my question. What percentage of...
I'm going to address that.
The answer is pretty close to zero.
And I'm going to address that. American Jews like to look and say, oh, there's no Israeli left. Is it that the Israeli left suddenly lost their moral bearings? No. Everybody in Israel feels depressed and hopeless. When you do a survey of whether they think there's a possibility of a two-state solution, you get very, very little. But if you change the question and you say, would you support a two-state solution in the context of a regional peace with the Arab world, the percentages go way up. So what you're seeing, you can't paint Israel with a brush that nobody there cares about peace. Right now, they're hopeless. And that's what leads to this.
Okay. First of all, I didn't paint that brush. Someone else.
Well,
no, you didn't listen to what I said. You painted me with a brush that I didn't use. But the fact is, what I did say is that Israel's had 5 elections in a row where no party argued for peace with the Palestinians, except for the parties that didn't even make it into the Knesset this time. There were 2 parties that argued for peace just in general terms, not argued for specific concessions that would have to be made for peace, like dividing Jerusalem and doing something about the right of return. Nobody at all talked about that. But the two parties that said, yeah, peace would be nice, one of them made it into the Knesset, one of them didn't. They didn't get the necessary, I think it's 5% to get into the Knesset. So maybe if you're incredibly generous, 10% of Israelis are interested in peace at the time. So in that case, you could say I'm only speaking about 90% of the Israelis. But the fact is that there is no significant opposition to the war in Gaza in Israel, politically speaking. None. Now, I wrote a 512-page book. I didn't do binaries. I did complicated. I do complications. That's the problem with the discussion. And that's why I wrote a book about it. Because everything is really complicated. I hope that I implied a great deal of complication in everything I said. But everything is really complicated. And yet people get their backs up when they hear something they don't like, and they accuse the other person of saying, but wait, you said this, and you didn't mention this. Well, maybe I didn't mention it. Maybe it's worth talking about. But the fact is that all of this is terribly complicated, and our discourse on it doesn't allow for that complication. And that's actually an argument just for the value of books, in my opinion. But also, it's an argument for why it's so difficult to discuss this particular issue, because it's very hard for people to assimilate facts that are inconsistent with their identities.
So I have just 2 comments. One is I really agree with you that for us as Jews in the United States, how we educate and involve our youth is crucial. And I think that's really your main point at the end, your end main point. But I'd also like to ask about UNRWA and the special role that the Palestinians have had with the United Nations establishing that, and how you think that influences what's happening and what can happen because they have that kind of agency for them.
Yeah, On the one hand, I wouldn't characterize it the way you just did. On the other hand, I don't know enough about it to feel comfortable talking about it with any degree of expertise. I feel very uncomfortable with the fact that Israel has this state, the Jewish state, considers human rights organizations to be its enemies. That wasn't my idea for a Jewish state, that it couldn't handle human rights investigations. And yes, most of the nations, a great many of the nations in the world and that make up the UN are entirely hypocritical with regard to Israel. And you could point to the Uyghurs. I don't know how to pronounce them, but they have a shit life thanks to the Chinese, and they get Uyghurs, thank you. And they get, 1/1000th of the press coverage for it. And the Syrians, what they did to their own population is horrific. Does that make it okay, what Israel is doing in Gaza? No, they're two entirely separate issues. And they deserve to be discussed separately. So I almost called my book, What About? Because that's too often how public discussions about Israel go. So I'm not going to defend UNRWA. I don't know if I should or not, but I'm not going to. I'm not in a position to do that. But to me, the problem of Israel starving millions of people and not allowing medical aid in and not allowing food in, and we have no idea what the and starvation policies in the rest. Again, personally, this is my opinion, I can barely stand to live in this world where that's happening. And I can't imagine any justification for it. And I know what those justifications are, and they don't do it. So, yeah, I don't like Hamas, I couldn't believe when I woke up on October 7th in the middle of the night and I read those numbers of what had happened. I couldn't believe it. It changed my understanding of what humans are capable of. But again, that doesn't, saying I hate Hamas, I'm horrified by what they turned out to be capable of. It's no justification. It doesn't change what I think about what Israel is doing either. There are people, you read them on the op-ed page in the New York Times, and certainly the Israeli government, that says every single person who's being starved to death, who's been killed in a hospital or a school, that's the fault of Hamas. They're on Hamas's conscience. I'm sure that some people in this room feel that way. I don't feel that way. And it shocks me that leave aside the fact that it shocks me. It shocks enough American Jews, particularly young American Jews, that it threatens American Judaism itself. That's the point I would make about it.
Let's take one more question.
You were very enthusiastic in raising your hand. Be nice. It's the last question.
So I'm a student at McAllister College, and we have a lot of pro-Palestinian demonstrations.
It's a good school, McAllister College. Is it around here? Yeah, it's a good school. Yeah. Go ahead. Your president wrote a very good book. That's why I know it. The former president of McAllister wrote a very good book. Go ahead.
But yes, my question is about what you mentioned earlier in your lecture about the maximalist position that the PLO, I believe it was, takes towards their status as a nation. I was wondering how that plays into the thoughts of the organizers of these college demonstrations in the United States.
It's interesting that we haven't gotten to the discussion of the demonstrations till now, because there's so much on people's minds. I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow, I think, but I read the demands of the student demonstrators, and they strike me as ridiculous. I mean, I'm a professor at the City University of New York, and these kids who took over the hall at CUNY, my colleagues send out letters saying we have to support these kids, And I went to the trouble to read their demands, and they were insane, we demand that we denounce the Zionist entity, and they sounded like they were written by Hamas. And I'm thinking, the City University of New York is going to end all of its dealings with Israel? Like, they're just helping the right wing of Israel by saying that stuff. They're helping they're helping Donald Trump by saying that stuff. But then I remembered being young, a long time ago. But here's the thing. I was a columnist at The Nation for 25 years, and I was the most conservative person at The Nation for that entire time. And the reason I was the most conservative was because whenever The Nation would write an editorial saying, we have to do this, and I, by the way, I published letters to the editor of The Nation when I was a columnist there, attacking their editorials about Israel. I would always say to The Nation, whatever else to the issue, they would say, the time has come to finally whatever. And I would say, wait a minute, why are we here now? And what are the steps necessary to get to where you say the time has come? Like, the world is the way it is for good reasons, or bad reasons, but actual reasons. And you have to deal with those reasons to get to where you want to go. Otherwise, you're stuck where you are. So I'm a conservative liberal because I'm a pragmatic liberal, okay? I'm only interested in, if you give me an idea that will help the Palestinians to stop living in the horror that so many of them are forced to live in. By the way, I've been in a Palestinian refugee camp in 1980s. It's the worst place I've ever been in my life. I can't bear to think about it. Now, these students, they're not thinking that way, okay? They're saying, I can't bear to be associated. I can't bear to have my assent given to the horrors that I'm seeing coming out of Gaza. And so I'm demanding that my college divest itself from this horror. And if it's not going to divest itself, then I at least want to be able to say I did whatever I could do, which is chant and wear a keffiyeh and yell at Zionists, okay? It's not a good way to go about it. And they're not going about anything that's actually going to happen. But they're expressing themselves as the kind of person they want to be. It's an expression of their identities, just like a lot of support for Israel is an expression of one's identity. And a lot of people who support Israel don't even know what they're supporting. You know, that's just who I am. I support Israel. I'm a Jew. I support Israel. They're saying I'm a liberal, or I'm a radical, or I'm whatever I am, and I don't want my college. I don't want to be associated with this thing. They're not thinking about, you know, the kids who got arrested at Hamilton Hall at Columbia. They really didn't do the Palestinians any good. You know, it didn't help anyone. They're not thinking, how can I actually improve this situation? They're thinking about who am I and what are my values and how can I express those values in such a way that other people can understand who I am and who I respect. Now, it's a problem to deal with, you know. It's a problem to argue with that position because it's not a practical position and it's not susceptible to logic. But if you understand that that's what's going on, and I think it is, then you can kind of live with it. You can say, okay, I understand that that's how you feel. I actually can imagine feeling that way myself if I were a young person seeing the horrors that one is seeing. But actually, if you really want to think about this in a practical way, think of more practical steps. So I'm a one-issue political analyst. Is it going to help Donald Trump or not? Okay? So I don't like those protests because they're helping Donald Trump. And we're going to lose our democracy and we're going to become a fascist country. And that's all that concerns me at the moment. So I don't like them. And they're not well thought out and they're illogical. But I can't hate them because, you know, youthful idealism is something you don't want to give up on, I would say. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bye.
I did promise you would be challenged, and I invite you to wrestle with it in the best, most productive way possible. If you would like to hear more of Dr. Alterman's analysis, you are invited to join us on campus tomorrow at noon to hear him speak about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, why the confusion, and why it matters. You may find details about the lecture on the Center for Jewish Studies events page on our website. I also brought a few flyers out on the table out there, and I'll note that parking is being provided through the generous support of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Thank you. Advanced registration for the lecture is required because of those security measures that he talked about. But no, it's not too late. You can still register. Our next community lecture here at the JCC will be on Wednesday, November 13th. Come hear Noah Tamark and speak on Jewish identity, genetics, and indigeneity, remapping Jewish histories and futures. There are flyers also on the table. Please remember to register in advance, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you so much for coming and for your excellent time.